neighbours, people have said to have heard a noise from the other side, letting us know that someone close to us is going to die. Sometimes it's just 3 taps to a window, 3 knocks on a wall. Have you heard anything like that? Because if you lived around South Shields in the 1840s, you would know Jack the Hammer. He was a traveller who picked up manual labour as he found it. He'd carry out jobs such as carpentry, repairing pots and pans, and although everyone felt comfortable to have him around, he never really managed to gather any friends around him. He lived in a part of South Shields that's now known as the Nook, and remained almost a hermit in his own house. He never answered a knock at his front door, merely stared down from his tatty net curtains. A tall, blondish man with sagging shoulders and a huge beak-like nose, grimacing at anyone that dared to bother him. People were so often rebuffed that they simply stopped calling on him, and neighbours had never heard a sound from him, even when he was at home for long periods. When in his 50s, he suffered a bout of flu and he remained in bed, tried to sleep it out of him. And all that happened was that he became weaker and weaker, eventually dying from the lack of nourishment. His neighbours were not aware that he died, and the body began to decay in the rocking chair that he died in. Eventually, though, a pungent stream of mixed bodily fluids began to seep down through the floorboards onto the couple that lived below them. They were eating lunch when the dripping began, dropping into their soup and onto their lap. At first they thought it was condensation, but it built up to be a fair old stream, stinking out the lower flat too. On investigating, they discovered the man almost mummified. He was covered in cobwebs and sat there palely as they shrieked in horror. He was carried out of the house in that rocking chair, covered with a sheet, and taken away for burial on the back of a cart. In due course, the house was sold and nothing untoward was reported. However, many of the South Shields people claimed regularly to still see the shape of that stooping man at around 6 in the evening, walking along the Nook. Some said that he appeared on the riverside during times of thunderstorms and gales as a sign that someone was about to be lost at sea. Other tales tell of how he hammers out a warning of the impending death on the wall of any house occupied by a man who goes to sea. In 1941, Mrs. Margaret Brown heard a tremendous hammering sound on the side of her house in South Shields. 2 days later, she received a letter saying that her son had lost his life aboard the HMS Hood, sunk by the Bismarck, when only a handful of the 1,421 crew managed to survive. In 1982, Mr. Roger Douglas of Tynemouth was staying with his mate Paul Somerville in South Shields. He was woken by a loud hammering on the side of the house and immediately looked out of the window. As the hammering continued, there was no one there. The following Saturday, Paul received a letter from an old person's home to say that his mother had died. Have you had that knocking? So let's dance to another part of the Northeast that's got a good story to tell. In the early 1700s, when Gateshead was very much Newcastle's poor relation, times were hard, and only those with money ever prevailed. And one such man was Charles Henderson, who used to buy and sell goods from both Scotland and the south, selling them at a huge profit to anybody that he could. He created an early form of car boot sale, taking his goods on a horse and cart to homes and villages as far away as Durham, Stanley, South Shields and Hexham. Within a year he was wealthy. Within 5 years he was rich. Henderson's Gallowas horses were renowned, people believing that they were getting huge bargains. Now, admittedly, the things he sold were only available in the big cities, so to find fine fabrics, delicate ornaments, luxury food items in a back lane in a small village was bound to create interest. The richer Henderson became, the more he delegated the work to younger men. all quite poor and very keen to earn any kind of living. By 1755, Henderson was in his late 30s, rich, yet still unfulfilled, so he took himself a bride. Now, her name was never known. Some say he bought the young girl from her father for a sum of 5 shillings. Henderson's close friends were introduced to a staggeringly attractive brunette, whom he called Sophie. She never left his house on Windmill Hill, just out of the centre of Gateshead, overlooking the River Tyne. Her only visitor was the old tinker who had provided her, who claimed to be keeping check on his daughter's progress. Within a year, she was pregnant, and Charles Henderson was thrilled. He would have an heir, and all of his hard work could become a family concern. Everything was going for him. He had started providing coal carts and coach services. His gallowers were still pouring profit in his direction, and overtures were made for him to go into politics. And then, in November 1756, the Duke of Newcastle resigned as Prime Minister, and the groundswell of northern opinion was that Charles Henderson should put himself forward. And yet, this he refused to do, claiming, "This war with France will ruin many men, but not Charles Henderson." And William Pitt became Secretary of State and gathered other northern ministers to face the French threat. Charles Henderson was very much his own man, though, and despite it being totally against tradition, he attended the birth of his son. The delivery had been difficult, and on seeing the child, Henderson reeled back in horror. The infant's face was horribly deformed. Storming out of the house, he ran along the street crying out, "God has cursed me with a devil for a son." He was found by friends sitting in an inn on the corner of what's now Charles Street, where he was trying to drown his sorrows. He then sobbed uncontrollably into the arms of an old woman. Some say he refused to return home for almost a month. But when he did, his demeanour was very different from that of the loving man he once was. He became an ill-tempered brute with his servants, hurling abuse at them and behaving contemptuously towards his wife Sophie. His son was named George after the composer Handel, but Henderson refused to call him that, preferring to call him the Grunt. Young George had one eye higher than the other, his nose was totally flat, and the cleft palate had viciously twisted his mouth, causing him to talk in a low grunt. Henderson consulted physicians. None had the expertise to do anything for the youngster. And as the boy entered his teens, his problems increased. It seemed the taller he grew, the more stooped he became. On his 16th birthday, the terrifying truth emerged. During a vicious argument, Sophie told Henderson that George was not his son. She'd been carrying such a great burden, and it all spilled out like a leak in the Atlantic. First, Henderson learned that Sophie's mother was also her sister, who had been the victim of incest since she was 12 years old. And once Sophie had reached that age, their father turned his attentions upon her. And even after her marriage, he'd been visiting her and having sex as he had done throughout her childhood. Sophie'd been too frightened and ashamed to tell her husband. The child was deformed because of inbreeding. It was as if someone had wrenched out his heart. Henderson grabbed his silver-top cane and went straight to the slums that existed on what is now roughly Gateshead's bus station. He entered the home of the tinker and beat him to death. He then set fire to the hovel and left. The authorities interviewed Henderson, who admitted to beating the old man, but claimed to have left before the fire started. And such was his influence at the time, charges were never brought against him. And from that day, young George was never allowed out of the old mansion on Windmill Hills. He remained confined to his 12-foot room, and he died of influenza at the age of only 39 in 1795, having been hidden away for almost 24 years. People said he had never ever been out in the sun. Henderson never slept with Sophie again, and she ran off 3 months after her son died. It was believed that she set up home with a butcher in Salt Meadows Road. Henderson's financial empire crashed around his ears. He had no appetite for it anymore. He allowed various parts to be taken from him by his own employees, who struck out on their own. In 1789, there was a mysterious fire that burned down the businessman's mansion, and despite a thorough raking through the ashes, no one ever found the body of Charles Henderson, and some say that his spirit will not rest until it is found. 2 ghosts walk Windmill Hills. One, the grief-stricken old man with a silver-topped cane who can be heard weeping or seen holding his head in his hands in doorways. The other desperate ghost is said to be that of George Henderson, who hammers on doors begging to be released, clawing with bloody fingernails at heavy doors. Now, one of the buildings built on the site of their Henderson home later became an unemployment benefit office, and an ex-employee, Tom, said, "I worked there for a good few years and often heard late in the afternoon doors slamming and a hammering coming from upstairs as if someone were trapped. And if you followed the sound, it came from one of the rooms on the very top floor. Despite our radiators being on full blast, it was always bitterly cold. And occasionally people would claim to have seen glimpses of a man with a hunched back hobbling around. One of my colleagues, a woman in her 50s, actually fainted while sitting in the ladies' loo because she heard a man grunting behind her in a sexual manner. We had to burst the lock on that door to get in, dress her. We then took her to the Queen Elizabeth Hospital outpatients. She had such a shock, she was off work for almost a month. She came back for a fortnight and then found a job with a local electricity board. And whilst walking her dogs past Windmill Hills one cold Sunday morning in 1982, Mrs. Kathleen O'Connor experienced something very strange. She claims that she heard a woman screaming and flagged down a police car. She pointed police towards the old house, telling them she had heard shouts of, "Father, no, don't do this to me," followed by screams of agony and torment. The police checked the scene, yet no evidence of wrongdoing. Had that been the horrified pleadings of young Sophie being raped yet again by her incestuous father? Now, before I share my final tale with you today, I just want to tell you about some lost treasure, because nobody else will tell you about this. Near Houstead's Fort, there is said to be a box of treasure at the bottom of the lake at Broomley Lough. Everything about it is a mystery, and all I can merely recount to you are some of the variables so you can make your own mind up as to whether you believe any of them. On researching this particular legend, I was told that the treasure was the Holy Grail deposited there by Sir Galahad for safekeeping when Arthur was close to death. I also heard it was King John's treasure that had been rescued from the Wash and carted north by border reivers. The collected treasure was from the man known as Robin Hood. He'd believed that his men were about to betray him, so he arranged for all of his most valuable gold and jewels to be placed on a boat and sunk in the middle of a lake far from where he did his thing. I also heard it was the Ark of the Covenant, secretly brought to Britain whilst the body of Christ was moved and buried beneath Rennes in France. Whichever path you chose to take, the treasure is certainly worth uncovering. On several occasions throughout history, they have tried to remove the treasure, and in the process, horses, donkeys, and dogs have been killed in efforts to drag the bottom of the lake. Mrs. Ivy Hall from Saltburn visited the lake and paddled at the water's edge on a hot, sunny day in 1953. She'd suffered from verrucas and ingrowing toenails, yet on removing her feet from the water, all affectation was gone. Locals say that there is a religious artifact, blessed by God, that lies in the lake and those who believe in God, who bathe there, will be cured from whatever ails them. But just to complete our grisly tale, I've decided to take you to one of the greatest castles left standing anywhere in Great Britain, Bamborough. It was used as Macbeth's castle in Roman Polanski's film. It is the archetypal northern fortress. Earlier structures on this site were probably used by the Romans and Celts, who called it Dingwaroi. Yet only when the walls were changed from wood to stone did it become to be known as impregnable. The fate of the Northumbrian king, St. Oswald's, leads to one of the more creepy stories of Bamborough Castle. Oswald was determined to kill off a wave of pagan worship and ritual by restoring Christianity to the confused, drunk, and too sexed up Northumbrian tribes. He was helped in this by dozens of monks who landed in Cumbria and travelled across Britain with Oswald's help, setting up a monastery on Lindisfarne, Holy Island. Northumbria lived in peace under Oswald until Penda, the pagan king of Mercia, murdered him at Mazerfelth. Perhaps it was the fact that a deeply religious king had been put to the sword by a pagan warlord that sparked the fierce legends. The terrifying tales began when Penda returned Oswald's body to Bamborough in pieces. His head and hand were embalmed. The rest was buried in sacred ground. Then, strange things began happening. When in the mid-700s, Oswald's head disappeared. Some say it was stolen, others suggest it had been taken by the angels because he was such a holy man. As if cursed, the fortunes of Bamborough went into rapid decline. Viking raiders raped, pillaged and murdered the people of the town, and many were forced to live further inland. Even religious figures began to steal their own silver and gold crosses and crucifixes. In the time of William the Conqueror, Bamborough Castle became a Norman stronghold. Yet another British fortress to protect our new rulers from their new slaves. And it was during this unsavoury time that one so-called monk crept into the chapel where St. Oswald's hand remained as a sacred relic. He hid it on his person and fled. And it's said that the monk was later found strangled some days later. The locals swore it was Oswald's own hand that had choked the life out of him. The fortunes of Bamborough continued to seem cursed with bad luck. Robert of Mowbray was trapped by William Rufus at Bamborough late in the 10th century. In the 16th century, the rich Forster family owned Bamborough, only to go bankrupt. In later years, the castle and associated lands were bought by the Bishop of Durham, Nathaniel Crewe, who subsequently became Lord Crewe. The hotel, the Lord Crewe Arms in Blanchland, still bears his name, and that suffers countless hauntings. Lord Crewe would die without ever having the child that he so deeply desired, and after his death, the castle fell into disrepair. The fortunes of Bamborough seemed to change as soon as Oswald was made a saint. Almost at once, the curse of Oswald's hand was brushed away. The very first Lord Armstrong bought Bamborough Castle, restoring it to its present glory. The curse may be gone, but many visitors have suffered an unpleasant shock. Harry Reid's a local fisherman. He was reeling in his nets just off Bamborough when he saw a human hand in them. In shock, he dropped the net back into the water, losing his catch and the hand. He didn't know anything about St. Oswald, so it seemed best to leave him happy in his ignorance. He said he had not reported it to the police in case they thought he was crazy. When a school party visited the castle in 1963, one of the girls had to be rushed to hospital after having a screaming fit. On reaching hospital in a teacher's car, she'd calmed down. The teachers had all seen the children holding each other's hands so that none would get lost. The girl told doctors, "I was holding Susan's hand, but when I looked back, Susan wasn't there. Just a hand with no one on the end of it. The doctors and the teachers both put it down to her imagination. And during the making of Roman Polanski's Macbeth, starring John Finch and Francesca Annis, 2 extras dressed as soldiers had a shock. Roger and Brian, 2 lads from Bedlington, they both swore they saw a human hand crawling across the sand while they took a break. They thought at first it must be some kind of electronic gadget being used by the special effects department. Both had watched a few horror films when hands had done this before, and they presumed it was a practical joke. Both commented how clever it was, until they realized there was no one else about. And finally, David Hobb was a taxi driver. And one night he drove a fare from Alnwick to Bamborough, a fare well worth taking, worth a lot of money. Halfway through the journey, he looked in his rearview mirror and he saw the woman sitting in the back seat, and beside her, climbing across the back of her seat, was a human hand. He shouted to her, "What's that?" She looked around, she saw the hand and started screaming. The taxi crashed, went off the road and hit a small farm wall. They both swear they saw that hand.